The following is a video of a BBC Newsnight interview between Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, and BBC reporter Jeremy Paxman. It's going to highlight many of the themes that we've been talking about. To set the scene, it's a few years after the economic collapse, and people on the streets of London are voicing their resentment that while they're struggling to get by, they're noticing that the super-rich bankers who started the problem in the first place are too wealthy to be affected and are carrying on with their lives as though nothing had happened. A two-tier society has emerged.
People are very, very conscious and increasingly conscious of the number of people, whether they're Russian oligarchs, fleeing African despots, Arabian sheikhs or anyone else who are walking the streets of this city and against whom they begin, frankly, to feel rather resentful.
You're talking about a sort of resentment of the super rich.
Yes.
And,
yes.
And again, I understand that. I think people do feel alienated and they feel very hostile and suspicious. What I want to do, I don't want to harm the wealth generating, the tax generating potential of this city. But I do want to see these people that you describe showing much more commitment.
What do they do for us?
Well, I think what they could do is give a lot more. This city
Why don't we just tax them more?
Well, this city is built on the very largely in the 19th century on the euergetism, the generosity, the philanthropy of dynamic people who made colossal sums of money. And they built schools, and they went out and they founded hospitals and orphanages. And what makes me...
They're not doing it now.
They're not doing it now.
And they should,
They should do it now. And it's quite incredible to me that people can walk away with multi-million-pound bonuses and not understand that what people want to see is them doing what the great Titans did in the Victorian era.
If they refuse to do it, is it not the obligation of the state to take sufficient money from them by force of law to ensure that it is done?
That is the obvious answer.
Yes.
The trouble with that answer is that you end up with a tax burden that is, frankly, a deterrent to investment and to enterprise in London. So that's you're right to put it that way, but that is the dilemma.
Why did the morality of capitalism change in that way? What happened to benevolent capitalism?
I think people got into a kind of mindset which I think is quite wrong. They started to, because tax advanced and people felt that they were paying more and more of their incomes in taxation, they somehow thought that they'd made their contribution, and they somehow started to think that their obligations were over. And they failed to see that a huge gap is opening up between the super rich and the rest of society, frankly. And I think that they need to understand that. You can do...
That gap's really dangerous, potentially, isn't it?
It's not healthy. There are huge numbers of people in this city who are making an awful lot of money. We want them here, we want them to make money, we want them to generate jobs and growth for the rest of society. But they've got to understand that they're lucky to be here, I would say. It's a fantastic city to live in, and that they could make a much, much bigger contribution.
Boris Johnson, thank you.
Thank you.
So here's what's basically happened in that exchange. Jeremy Paxman says that there are all these super rich people serving only themselves with their money and that it's a problem. They're not using their freedom well. The mayor agrees, but remembers that there was a time in the 19th century when rich people didn't serve themselves, but instead used their riches to benefit others. They freely built schools, hospitals, orphanages, and generally improved society with their generosity and charity. But they're not doing it now, and both agree on that point. Then we see Paxman falling into the trap of suggesting that if they no longer do it by their own free will, they should be forced to do it by force of law, i.e. taxes. If they won't hand over the money freely, the government should just forcibly take the money from them by law. At this point, the mayor says that if they did that, then all the rich people would just find a way around the laws by leaving the city and conducting their business from elsewhere, like Geneva or Zurich. And that would be to the detriment of the City of London and the UK economy. You can't make men good by law. They just find loopholes and ways around the laws. They then both scratch their heads at this conundrum and wonder aloud why the morality and benevolence of the city folk has taken such a nosedive. Why are they so selfish now? Where has the charity and generosity gone? Boris shakes his head and stares out the window looking for an answer. They just can't understand it. What has happened to people's benevolence? What went wrong? People know something has gone wrong, but they just can't see what. Boris then finishes by saying that when the law is already very severe, it builds a resentment in the population that the government is taking so much of their money, and they start to adopt a begrudging minimum requirement mentality. Paxman suggests that this whole thing is potentially very dangerous. That resentment, the widening gap between the two tiers, may eventually lead to rebellion. Now see the pattern here. People abandon God, become selfish, society crumbles, the government throws laws at the people to try to keep the whole thing together, the people become resentful about those mounting laws and start to rebel. C.S. Lewis rightly said, "You cannot make men good by law, and without good men you cannot have good society. That is why we must go on to think of morality inside the individual." The only way to cure society is to heal the heart sickness. The people of the world need internal renovation, just as the people of Israel needed internal renovation. That's the only way to keep society both free and good, and Jesus, by his Holy Spirit, is the only one who can offer it. Why is it that our grandparents and great-grandparents lived in a society with less laws, and yet things were morally, socially, and economically better than they are now? A time when people were more generous and caring than they are now. A time when it was safer for kids to play on the street, and when they could eat and drink what they wanted but didn't become morbidly obese. The reason is because in those days people governed themselves so well that they didn't need an outside force trying to do it for them. Why were they better able to self-govern? Why were they more generous? Why could they restrain their selfish desires better? What was it within the hearts of the super-rich Victorian Titans that meant they chose to use their money to build schools and hospitals rather than buying themselves another yacht or private jet? Because there was a time when the inner part of man was better than it is now, and the reason it was better was because more of them had Christ. They had a reference point for their moral compass and the Holy Spirit working within their hearts. And even those that weren't Christians were better informed of the moral law through the 4 C's of conscience, creation, civil law, and the Great Commission, because they were given a Christian education. We are just further along the line of a downward curve of moral entropy and an increasingly desperate need of a revival of faith. Just a little footnote to this part before we move on. I have often heard it said that the Bible is a socialistic book, but this is not true. There is a big difference between freely offered charitable giving from love and the legalistic taking and redistribution of wealth by force of government, as prescribed by socialism.